primarily because I'm going to address a few of the questions that you pointed to are sort of analytically intractable, which gives me an excuse for not having attempted to solve them. And so I'm going to talk about search in biological systems and in robotics. And in fact, the last question was a great segue. My answer is now. Now is when we should start exploring. So I'm going to talk about collective search processes with agents, unlike SIDS, that have some cognitive ability, but not much. Things like ants and cells in your body that have some ability to sense variation in their environment and respond to it, but maybe not a lot. And I want to think about what that means for designing engineered systems for distributed collective search. And so a great thing to think about is the Opportunity rover, which took 11 years to travel the distance of a marathon. So it's an impressive piece of technology, but not so fast.
So, I mean, when it's doing this traveling, they have someone on Earth who's looking at the camera and saying, okay,
it is
turn right.
joystick control.
But then it's like, is it an 8-minute time delay?
It's up to a 40-minute time delay. It depends on the distance between Earth and Mars, but the round trip. Yes. Yeah, the round trip is between 8 and 40 minutes.
Okay.
Right, so that's most of the reason it's so slow, is that they'll tell it to go 4 meters, and they'll wait, and they'll make sure it got there, and then it'll tell it to take the next step. So the lack of autonomy is a good piece of the reason that they have to move so slow. Also, it's a couple $1 billion, right? So you really don't want to wreck it. And so an alternative is to send a bunch of cheap robots. So we build cheap robots. And these cheap robots that we built, we have, we run a competition, and in that competition, we would have actually about a dozen of them would travel 26 miles every day. This would be a competition. Now, the conditions were a little easier, right? We weren't on the surface of Mars. But the point is, when you have lots of small, cheap parts, you can take bigger risks. And if you have parts that can move in space, obviously you can cover a whole lot more distance quickly. And so what I want to talk about is how we can sort of automate the discovery, so we're sort of searching for search processes that work well in complex environments using simple agents. And so these are our simple $1,500 robots now. I think we could build them for considerably less. And we want to think about how would we search in unstructured environments. So on the continuum of sort of the factory floor where robots work really well, to self-driving cars, which are actually in quite structured environments, right? There's pavement with lines. This is sort of further along that continuum. This is, the college campus where the robots have to kind of navigate around some people. They don't quite know where the things are they're looking for, but they do know what they're looking for. How do we're thinking about unreliable hardware, unreliable communication, and really importantly, no centralized control. And so our model really, I sort of am telling the story robots first, but really we're using robots really to understand how biology is solving this problem. So the kinds of problems that one might think about, so in space exploration, we're really interested in questions of how do we search for resources when those resources might be distributed in interesting ways. So a number of things in nature on Earth and on the Moon and on Mars seem to be power law distributed, meaning there's a few big patches and lots of small patches. How should we change our search strategy if we actually know that? Or if we don't know the underlying distribution, but we can sample as we go? How might we think about looking for something that is ephemeral? So water on Mars is a good example. And in these two problems, our sort of use case, this is actually a project funded by NASA, and they're interested in, if we're going to send humans to the Moon, it's really expensive to send things that weigh a lot, so we want them to the Moon, or more specifically to Mars. They're going to go a long way, they're going to need food when they get there, they're going to have to gather resources. So they have this living off the land project. So you have to gather these things, they're ephemeral, they're distributed in ways you might not know, and you need them all in one place. So you have this transport problem that's kind of an essential part of your search problem. Search and rescue applications have additional constraints, like you need to be really quick, right? If you have people that are, in a shipwreck, you need to find them super fast. On the other hand, if you're doing landmine detection or you're cleaning up hazardous waste, you need to be really thorough. So all of these different aspects of the search problem kind of come into play, and we're interested in sort of how can we adapt, have kind of a suite of strategies that we could adapt to solve different aspects of this problem. So I'll start off talking about search in biology. I'll probably get distracted by how much I am amazed at these biological systems, and then I'll end with some of the sort of empirical studies that we've done in robotics. So the two systems that we use to ask about search behaviors are ant colonies and immune systems. So the movie that's playing here this is a movie of T cells. These are immune cells, and they are crawling over the surface of a sacrificed mouse's lung. So these are sort of zombie cells. The mouse has been sacrificed, but the cells are kept alive. And we make movies of how these cells move, because really what they're doing is they're searching, in this case, for the flu. And they don't know how much flu is there. In fact, over time, the amount of flu changes, the patchiness of the flu changes, all sorts of changes happen. But these cells are autonomously searching, no centralized control. They have some communication, and they are very, very good at finding the flu quickly. And if they don't, then you die. So there's really great selective pressure on this. This is a little blurry to see, but these are ants crawling around in the desert. And most of what I talk about here will be about these ants. Although almost every search strategy that we have characterized in ants has some very nice analogy in these immune cells that are doing a similar kind of search, where it is the search strategy is sort of, I would argue, kind of emerging from whatever internal algorithm the cell or the ant has, the interactions that those agents have with each other, and then really importantly, the interactions that they have with the environment that gives them some clue about whether they're sort of doing the right thing. Bees were mentioned earlier, and bees are fine. I like bees. But I think if we're looking for a collective, sort of the best collective search that's evolved, humans are doing pretty well. But keep humans out of the equation, ants are doing really well. So there's about 14,000 ant species that have been identified. They live anywhere any animal can live, so every biome on Earth. Their biomass is equivalent to that of humans. So these are I forget now how many thousands of trillions of ants there are in the world, ecologically incredibly successful lineage of species, which I think we could say sort of, what their niche is they are very good at searching. They're very good at foraging, also very good at cooperating. And so, to play this little movie, these are ants in various different habitats. My mother-in-law's kitchen counter. They show up every time I visit, and she blames them on me, but I don't call them. This is ants on the forest floor, and each one of these, billions of leaves that are moving every day are sort of collected one by one. And so we're interested both in the flexibility, how do they exist in all these different habitats, and the scalability, how do they grow to these enormous sizes this is an ant colony that's being excavated. These are normal-sized humans, right, that are excavating this colony of 20 million ants. And in the background, you can sort of see these colonies are just filling this space. So immensely, these large colonies grow, but they start usually with one or a few queens. Right, so it's got to sort of have this ontogeny of being a successful forager with a handful of individuals or millions of individuals. Okay, so that's impressive, but not nearly as impressive as what's the search that's going on inside your body right now, where these T cells are, not only do they have this intense selective pressure to act quickly, they are searching in all kinds of different environments. So these are movies of T cells searching in lymph nodes. So your lymph nodes are where your T cells go, and they swell up because the T cells are looking for evidence of pathogens there. So there's a certain kind of search they have to do in that environment. When the T cell essentially finds the evidence of a particular pathogen that particular T cell is able to counter, it then travels through your circulatory network to the right tissue, and it has another search, right, where it's looking for the flu or whatever is going on there.
When you say it travels through the circulatory system, how does it know when to get off the train?
It's a great question. So there are traffic signals basically. So there are molecules that indicate the organ to go to, and so if you have an infection that came from the lung, that evidence of that infection goes to lymph nodes near your lung. There are tags that tell the T cell essentially travel back to the lung. And there it's sort of a random search. So it will search will take multiple hits, right? It's traveling super fast through your circulatory system. If it gets to a capillary and there's no signal of a problem there, it'll just recirculate and try again. So inflammation, so be careful taking Advil, right? Inflammation is the thing that tells your T cells and your immune cells there's a problem here. So it's the signal that tells more locally. Sort of.
Why am I correct? Advil?
Because it's an anti-inflammatory. Right, so it's damping down sort of the system that is the signaling system for your immune system. I take Advil, I think it's okay. And so some of the, what's amazing is the fact that, okay, so ants can scale to millions of ants per colony, and these immune systems are scaling to trillions of cells in the human body. Again, no centralized control, right? And individual cells have to move between different states where they're doing different kinds of searches in different organs. And part of what makes this effective is that they do use these structures of your circulatory network, finer scale structure inside the lung. This movie is actually showing T cells crawling along blood vessels. So they're using just the finest scale capillaries inside the lung as a structure to crawl along. And to put the problem into perspective, if we were to scale this up and make a T cell the size of a Mars rover, then it would be like it is, this swarm is covering 100 billion kilometers multiple times every day, right? So it's a really impressive sort of feat.
It's like piggybacking on the circulatory system.
It's piggybacking on the circulatory system. So that is a big, big part of why it can do that so efficiently. But it's key to have these signals to tell you sort of where to get off the highway.
You may be going here later, but is part of it, do they miss things? Like, do they ever have to, or does the next T cell come along, like how often do they miss signal?
Miss it, meaning do they, it's called
Inflammation
and somehow they miss it. I think it's a pretty good signal. It basically opens up sort of a hole in the wall that the cells crawl through. What the miss rate is there, I don't know, but again, that's kind of the redundancy of having trillions of cells. Almost everything all of these agents are doing are really imperfect, and that's sort of okay because there's so much redundancy.
So
good question.
T cells communicate with each other?
Yes, so
if there's a concentration of them?
yeah, and it's generally thought to be primarily mediated by other cells, so there's about 40 different cells in the immune system. The T cells will communicate to other cells, and all the other cells will sort of relay a signal. Whether there's direct T cell communication is actually something we're looking into now. It appears they amplify these inflammatory signals, and certainly they cause other cells to lay what are called chemokine trails, which are like pheromone trails, sort of chemical signals that create a gradient that will guide other T cells.
So if there's a higher concentration of T cells in one location, does that amplify the signal?
It does, at least in a general sense, in terms of creating a larger signal that radiates out. Whether it's a gradient that other cells follow to sort of localize is still a question.
So when your body fails to beat an infection with the T cells,
Mm-hmm.
what are the conditions under which, is it a concentration of T cells or an absolute number? The issue of failed searches becomes generalizable perhaps from that question.
Right. So those are the kinds of things we are modeling now. And some of the reason that it's hard to model that is we didn't, until people could make these movies, didn't know a lot about what the search process actually looked like. So for example, the modeling work that was done in the last decade assumed Brownian motion, that T cells were moving using a random walk, which is a really terrible way to search for things, right? It's like I lost my key, so I'm going to keep walking around in a circle over and over in the same spot and not walk across the room. So we've actually been trying to characterize the way that the T cells move in order to be able to answer questions like that.
There's also a lot of levels of complexity here in that some of these, there's memory involved, right? Immune systems have both short-term and long-term memory, and there's the predator equivalent here, which is some infectious agents actually attack the T cells themselves. So
Yeah, so there are many immune systems have memory. So T cells that are successful in the past, vaccines work because T cells that have been successful in the past stick around. But maybe the answer to your question is there are a million ways for this to fail, right? So we're sort of all lucky to be alive. Okay, so to delve a little bit more into kind of what the search process is that we studied in ants, which we can talk about analogies later with the immune system. We basically went out into the desert and we followed ants around for a few years and watched the way that they collect seeds. Kind of intentionally collect dispersed seeds in different sorts of distributions to see how they would respond to that. And then we built a model that simulated what we thought was the behavior that was going on. And so what you're looking at here that's not so clear maybe is these little dots moving around our ants. These colored patches are patches of seeds. And when the ants find seeds in big patches, they will lay a pheromone trail which evaporates over time, which is reinforced if the food persists and evaporates over time. And therefore it's able to sort of shift to new good patches of food. So sort of shifting from looking locally to a better big pile that's further away is achievable by this really simple mechanism by these pretty stupid ants, at least the ones that we're modeling are stupid. And so our model just has four kind of behaviors in it that we think are really important for the search. These are sort of the four things that make our ants smarter than your particles, right? Our ants are able to count. They're able to have some assessment of how good a patch is just locally. They are able to remember where they were last and return there. So that, and which turns out to be super important. And it is about the only thing these ants, when you watch them in the desert, it's the only thing they will do repeatedly. You can never make an ant do anything twice, as long as you watch, except go back to the last place where it found food, which they do quite consistently. And that's true of these ants and many other species. They lay these pheromone trails, right, which have this positive feedback that they're reinforced if they lead to food. And the movement patterns is something that we've actually spent a lot of time on. We've looked at levee walks. We've thought about different kinds of walks. Our models assume correlated random walks, meaning a walk where you can tune how frequently you turn, meaning how extensively or thoroughly you search. And that seems to be something that the ants also do. They look more thoroughly when they have information that something is in the region where they're searching. And so one of the things that I really like to highlight in this work is that the search strategy really does emerge from the interactions of the agents, each other, and the environment. And a good example of what sort of brought this home for us is that most people who built models of ant pheromone trails and foraging assume that ants always lay pheromones and wherever they go. And this is because the species that they happen to have in the lab did this. And the models that people built assumed that resources were just in big patches. And if that's the case, that's a good model. Whatever I find, I lay a pheromone trail. If everything is in one patch, that works very well. However, if you have dispersed resources and you use that rule, you just create noise, right? You create a path kind of to everywhere and therefore to nowhere. If you add a simple rule that says lay a pheromone trail only if I see a certain density of food, then the same exact rule in an environment with different sizes of patches becomes a map to where the big patches are. And so that's sort of the piece of this question that I've kind of found most interesting, is that really the strategy that emerges for search needs to be one that's sort of a conversation between the searchers and the environment, if the environment is complex. Okay, so I will just, in this thinking about the robotics piece of this, just take a little bit of time to talk about the strategy that we use, where we essentially study things in ants, we build simulations, we build robots to try to replicate what we think we understand, which we don't really understand when we do it in simulation. And we hope we'll get some interesting insights into robotics, but also in a deeper understanding of what the biological search processes are. I won't bore you. We make models. We have to turn these sort of understandings of ant behavior into equations that we put into sort of these simulations and in the brains of the real robots. But what we then do is use an evolutionary process, or a cartoon of an evolutionary process, a genetic algorithm, very simple idea that we have this model and it has a set of parameters that govern how the ants are counting and moving. And we just put in random values for this, typical GA, and we allow the searchers to search, and we repeat this process focusing on the parameter sets that do well, and over time we build up better and better search models.
How big is the parameter space? Are you able to exhaustively do it?
So interesting question, because these are real valued parameters. So it's as big as, but we're really only looking at these 7 parameters. So in we have figured out that we can sort of narrow things down, and we've done some sort of exhaustive searching of kind of reasonable space. And this GA approach works pretty well. This is a reasonable landscape. We wanted to use it because sort of, as a way to link the structure of the environment, we wanted to be able to sort of re-evolve for any new environment that we provide. And this just basically says, okay, this process works. We start off with, collecting small numbers, and we improve over time. And then we take those algorithms, those sort of tuned algorithms, and we put them in real robots. And this is just a quick video that gives you a sense of what this looks like. This is why I'm so glad that Sid spoke before me, because all of our experiments are with, of course, 6 robots. I didn't know why before we spoke this morning, but now I've got a great explanation.
They're living in 2 dimensions.
Okay, we'll sweep that under the rug. So these are sort of some of the initial sort of studies that we did with this, where we have these very simple robots. This is an iPod, basically an Arduino and some wheels. And it's got this very local myopic view. It's looking for these tags. When it finds one of these tags, it'll sort of look over, this is its counting. It'll return, these are our first robots. They can't even pick anything up. This is effectively dropping it off at this nest, like done. Okay, then it's gonna go back to this pile. It's using the site fidelity process, but it's a little off, right? These are cheap robots. They never go directly where you tell them. And so part of what we were trying to do is evolve algorithms that would work well, even though the behavior is really sort of stochastic and the ants are always making mistakes. And so that's sort of what we did here in this work. And I'll maybe cut to the end. So this is sort of the bird's eye view, where the robots, first of all, the robots are telling you where they are. They're always a little bit wrong. But when you speed this sort of process up, they look very ant-like, first of all. And we're actually able to take these parameters and show that we can tune the algorithm just by telling it what kind of error is there. The algorithm can actually change to compensate for the error. And so there's some data slides here. I think the basic message here is this works. We can tailor behaviors so that, if you evolve in a world full of clusters, then you do really well when you are put in a world full of clusters. And if you evolve in a random world, you do well in a random world, which I guess is over here. And that works when we even transfer these behaviors into the real robots. And it works based on things like, if the world is full of clusters, you want to communicate anytime you find food, right? If the world has clusters of different sizes, you want to be really picky about when you communicate that I found food. And actually, if you only find small, not dense piles of food, you should get it yourself and not communicate to anybody else. Which is, in fact, what we often observed totally frustratingly when we watched ants in the field. We would sometimes put out our large piles, had 256 seeds, and we would see one ant go 256 times back and forth to this pile, and we couldn't understand why until we realized that there's some other pile with 100,000 seeds in it, and everybody else was busy, right? And so that this was actually a sensible strategy. And so we were able to show that this sort of really simple process was able to tune based on how much error there is in the sensors, how much communication error there is, and what the distribution of things is in the environment. The algorithm would sort of make sense just by this trial and error process. Okay, we'll skip that. And the basic sort of message is, okay, we were able to sort of build these adaptable and flexible swarms. We could show that they were robust to lots of loss. Scalability was terrible. I probably won't have a chance to talk about this, but you can ask me about it in questions. We're good? We're good for time? Okay. I will then mention how what I showed you so far does not lead to scalable search. So I'll show you how we can get there. So from this ecological perspective, again, it's this idea that the complexity of search really emerges from this conversation of the agents with the environment. That evolution is the thing that allows that conversation to happen, right? It's what matches the parameters of the search to the environment that you're in. And that when we had mixed strategies, we were able to evolve sort of flexible, or we had mixed environments, we could evolve flexible strategies so that you could, for example, when you had a good ability to communicate and there were piles, you would communicate to those piles. When your sensing was off, or your ability to count was bad, you would give up on searching for big piles, and everybody would just independently search for things that were scattered at random.
How dependent was kind of the outcome on the initial conditions of how you actually set up the training, right? Like, how easy is it to find evolution that gets you into pathological cases, or does it all smooth out?
You know, everything that we've looked at so far, these sort of simple evolutionary approaches have worked pretty well. I think it's a good question. Right now, what we're trying to do is evolve to different sorts of problems, evolve from foraging problems to mapping problems. Even that seems to be working reasonably well. So I don't know. These are fairly simple.
Like setting up initial conditions that would try to lead to pathological behavior?
We did actually, and we didn't find any yet. Usually we did, and we found a couple of cute little sort of solutions to things that we hadn't thought about, right? Which is the one thing that genetic algorithms tend to uncover.
And the role of pheromone is virtual, right?
Yes, thanks for, yeah, so these are pheromone waypoints. So actually this is the one thing that's centralized in this is when they get to the server, which is the nest, they're allowed to ask, is there a pheromone trail to some place? It is not physically embodied as much as we tried with various kinds of alcohol and shaving cream and various things. We could not make pheromones that work in the physical world. So I'll just say what we've done to kind of go to sort of more interesting or sort of places where the environment is a little more interesting. There's a problem in evolutionary robotics called the reality gap, right? Folks right, and all the self-driving cars are kind of used to this idea that things that work really well in simulation don't always work so well in the real world. And so we wanted to think about scenarios where we could have a lot of error and a lot of environmental complexity that might be really hard to model. So you can model the error in the robot, but when the wind's going to pick up and blow your target away is often a little harder, right? And particularly if you want something that will work well in very different environments. So we did a bunch of experiments where we would use a more realistic physics simulator. We would replicate the exact thing outside and then sort of see how things played out differently. And this just gives you a sense, this physics simulator is simulating rovers that have more or less the physics of our real rovers. We can trace where they all are, and then we can repeat this same kind of experiment in the real world. So we did about 60 hours. My graduate student, Ki Lu, spent 60 hours outside in the hot sun, basically studying these robots, which we had evolved as though they were ants, right, to understand what their search sort of processes look like. So you get a sense of them here. And basically what we found when doing this, so these are, a lot of labor of love doing this. When we looked at the traces of how the robots actually moved, we had reasons to think that this deterministic spiral was about the best you could do for this foraging problem, where you have this interlocking spiral. And in fact, in theory, this is about 10 times better than our ant-inspired algorithm. When we do simulations, it's about 20% better. And then when we go out into the real world, actually, they look indistinguishable, right? This deterministic algorithm just turns into a mess when the robots are having to interact with each other, when they're dropping cubes because the light changed, because all of these things. And so something that's designed to be stochastic from the start actually outperforms the theoretically best algorithm in this case, which I think is another message that's sort of worth kind of thinking about. This is the last slide on scaling, which I'll mention because this is sort of deeply rooted in SFI ideas. This is the, 40-second version of the scaling rule is that big things are slow and live a long time. Small things live fast and die young. And we can predict the rate at which, the fact that an elephant has a heart rate that's 30 times faster than a mouse and a lifespan that's 30 times longer based on the scaling properties of basically a resource transportation network, the cardiovascular network. So there's good mathematical, though controversial, mathematical understanding of that. We were able to take that and turn that into how would we make a fractal branching transportation network for our robots? Because now we're imagining we're collecting resources over hundreds of kilometers on the surface of Mars, and the search problem really becomes largely a transportation problem. And so we were able to take sort of the mathematics of this and predict how we could get around big things being slow. And the answer to this is, well, if you had depots that were moving around and carrying things, you saw those big stacks, that's not really how you would carry things, but the long distance transport was in sort of large vessels, that would, it tells you how big the vessels have to be or how big the depots have to be. So we're now trying to build these depots. Automating this is a little harder than we expected for things like this, reasons like this. But it actually looks like this actually does work in simulation, that we get near linear scaling with size. And if only the robots could drop the cubes into the depot, finally, right, and it can drive away and deliver them, then. Yeah, same idea. And so that's sort of the last technical part of this. This is my acknowledgement slide where I want to acknowledge both Google. If anyone's here from Google, thank you for, actually some of the funding for this came from Google for an educational project called the NASA Swarmathon. Many of the students who did work on this were at this event, and this is an event where we sort of use a search problem to search for talented students, often in pretty hidden places, so community colleges, historically black colleges, tribal colleges. So this is an educational event. But we've been able to crowdsource. We've gotten dozens of algorithms for search, which we're then able to test in real robots at this competition. And so I will let that kind of play while we talk about whatever you want to talk about. Thank you.
So how many robots are you, like, what is Annie for your
Well, it is actually 6. I mean, all of this video has,
Yeah,
but we've built 100 and dispersed them out into the world for people to work with. We are able to scale up with these robots up to about 18 that are able to sort of do a search task together.
But I mean, did you include like the graduate student labor in building the 18 versus 6?
I mean, that's the constraint, right, on doing this.
But it seems like there's an optimization thing there, because how many graduate students can you possibly hire?
Right, yeah, so that is, the labor in building the swarm is a question. In practice, for a long time, we use robot operating system is the underlying code base here. And the part of the issue is actually that it is not scalable. This isn't really a completely distributed system. So we've finally gotten to a solution where, in theory, now we can have an arbitrary number of robots, and it's constrained by how many we can build and keep track of, right? They run away, and you have to chase them down. And so this is kind of questions.
We have ants problem in our house a while ago, and they found our trash bin. So we cleaned it up and removed the trash bin, and the next time they found it again. So I'm curious, like, whether you studied how ants adapt to changed environments, and how that's applied to your algorithm searching what if like the landscape on Mars changed after.
Right. So resources are ephemeral not just because the ants eat them, but because the world moves them. So we have done some work. Basically, there we have tried to predict when it is worth it to communicate. If things are really ephemeral, communicating "I found something here" is useless, right? And basically, it's useful if sort of 1.5 round trips. If it's still there after 1.5 round trips, it's worth communicating that you found it. The specific problem that you all have here, though, actually, is that you have these invasive Argentine ants, which work differently than most ants. They don't have a single nest, they can have multiple nests, these unicolonial ants. So these extend, there's a super colony, at least as some people describe it, that extends from Mexico up through Oregon, I think. So trillions of ants that roughly cooperate with each other, and therefore sort of extirpate the other local ant fauna, actually. That is actually in some ways a little more like the immune system. So the immune system, your lymph nodes, really are this sort of interconnected place where there's a local hub, there's some centralized flow, but the local hub allows you not to have to deal with the whole scaling problem of searching for resources between Mexico and Oregon, but being able to sort of cooperate and share across a network that can expand sort of almost infinitely. So the Argentine ants, you're not going to really get rid of them, but right, there are plenty more, and they have all kinds of interesting sort of signaling mechanisms. We actually wrote a paper about how they essentially have signaling mechanisms telling the other ants where to get off the highway, right? Where this is, where patches of food have been found, so that these ants that spend a lot of time moving between nests actually know when to get off and look for your trash can that you moved. Yeah.
So what's the communication means and also the capability between the ants and also between the T cells? So the reason I ask is because that for robots, and we have a lot of other communication means, for
Right.
example, wireless. So I'm wondering whether the communication is getting better and more powerful, then the optimal algorithm will change.
Great question. Thank you for asking that. The primary means of communication is chemical in both ants and T cells. So something like a pheromone trail is just a chemical trail that's laid and will naturally evaporate. And so has to be reinforced to stay in place, which leads to the nice property of it disappearing when it's no longer useful. Immune cells use what are called chemokine trails, which is effectively the same thing, and they have sensors on the surface of the cell that will sense the gradient, the amount of that chemical. So all communication is local, even though it can persist in the landscape over long distances. The actual sort of communicative event is it's touching a receptor on the ant or the cell. So we had to use we thought we would be so much better because we would use Wi-Fi communication, right, to indicate where something was. What we didn't realize is how fragile that is if you have cheap robots that are always lost. So when we actually implemented our models with our sort of fake pheromones, most of the time the robots would just mislead each other. Right? They would think that they were here, and they would say, look, I found a great pile of food, it's here, but actually they were over here. So what they were doing was misdirecting the other robots. And it took us a while to realize that they use the same mechanism to remember that site fidelity process where they go back to the same location over and over. They didn't misdirect themselves because each robot had its own error. Right? And so if your wheel tends a little to the right, you say you're in the wrong place, it doesn't matter, you go back to that wrong place over and over again. But when you then communicate to a robot that is going to veer a little bit to the left, then that miscommunication actually was sort of disastrous. So people, when they talk about ant communication, it's often expressed that the physical embodiment of the signal in the environment is important, but we didn't understand that until it went away and the system didn't really work anymore. And so that's, I think there certainly are cases where obviously, especially with, technology where you don't have these errors, where you have a more global view, that kind of communication can be really important. But I think it is worth kind of considering that the value of these kind of physically embodied communication things that have evolved.
Yeah, I would think one difference between the ants and the T cells is the kind of strategic adversarial nature of, like, the virus. So what happens to such if the target is doing everything in its power not to be found, and
Right.
actually messing with the pheromone trails?
Right, great question. So that is a question that kind of gets back to the earlier one about search and the immune system. I mean, the immune system is incredibly complex, right? I don't know why SFI doesn't just study the immune system. It's hard. You're done with it, right? It's right. I mean, there's so much complexity there, probably because it is a much harder search problem, because the targets are fighting back and hiding. And ants have this to some extent, right? I mean, when they're collecting seeds, the seeds don't fight back. But when they're collecting, other insects, or they're foraging for other insects, they can fight back. There does not seem to be much example in the literature of pheromone trail interruption. There's a little bit of search for that now. But with the communication system of the immune system, which is also sort of, it seems to work on this sort of security by obscurity principle that everyone in computer science says you shouldn't use. It's a really complicated system. There isn't evidence that pathogens have figured out sort of how to hack it, but there is evidence that pathogens have figured out how to mess it up, right? To just turn it off, make it not work. So there is some chemical kind of interference and even genetic interference to prevent communication among the cells. And so that's a particularly sort of pathological thing for the pathogens to do. I think it's not well understood. It's just being able to sort of uncover that this exists. It does point to sort of the importance of the
communication in.
But when you look at
fighting.
the statistics of the T cells ambling over the lungs as opposed to the ants, are there telltale signatures in the statistics of motion that might suggest?
Yeah, so what the T cells are doing a log normal correlated random walk. So the distances that they step seem to be log normally distributed. They don't seem to be doing a levy walk. We took that as evidence that their movement is actually fairly well tuned to the size of the environment that they're searching in. So they do a slightly different log normal walk in the lung, which is a big open space, compared to the lymph node, which is a smaller space. And so that seems that, again, it's a nice log normal distribution of step lengths in this walk. But there seem to be all sorts of other things kind of modulating it, the direction and the correlation. So I suspect that a lot of what we see is really evolved behaviors that have, again, been tuned over evolutionary time to work well in particular conditions. Yeah.
Is there similar work done on honeybees? Because that would be a 3D extrapolation of what the ants are doing.
Yeah.
How do they pheromones on the ant?
Right. So for honeybees have the waggle dance, right? So honeybees actually do have an abstract communication of a location to forage, right? They come back, they do this dance, and the dance indicates the direction and distance of where to find food. And they do seem to be very good at it, even though it's not sort of physically embodied. But as I said earlier, ants are superior to bees in almost all of
I also had a second question on the transport network factor picture that you showed. Was that done for a specific resource distribution, like the dependency?
Yeah, so what I showed you was a uniform distribution, which is easiest to sort of start with. But components of that, we've actually looked at, well, how would you, if you allow the agents to always return to sort of their nearest depot, and you allow the depots to move to the centroid of the most recently collected resources, then you can have this dynamic moving of the network so that it is always, the depots are sort of in the right place or the best place you can find so far. And the same idea kind of.
Moving according to where the resources are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I have a question. So you had mentioned earlier in your talk that there's sort of this interaction between search strategy and the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you're learning more and more about the environment, you might update your search strategy depending on the distribution of resources. Has anybody studied, or have you studied, or if not, do you have any intuition on how the search outcomes change if there's a variable or fixed time delay with updating the search algorithm between agents?
We've done simulations toying with that, but we haven't done any sort of analytical study of that. What actually seems to work fairly well is actually agents, adapting individually without needing to communicate, right? Sort of based on their own sampling. We're actually working on a little project right now where the agents are all reporting what they've seen in the world to the server, so so all agents have sort of the collective view of the world, and to ask the question, do they do better under those circumstances, so they can adapt their behavior based on the collective knowledge. I think that's promising, right? But I don't know the answer yet.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you have lots and lots of robots out there, self-driving cars, for instance, you can't update firmware all at the same time.
Right.
It could take weeks to, get all the firmware out there to, because there's a distributed network and, the Argentine counts, for instance, chemical signaling propagates, right? So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I don't know how much ants change their search strategy, or communicate that, or it's just sort of fixed.
Yeah, it seems that they don't change much on the scale of a foraging day, right? Or even probably over the lifetime of an ant. There seems to be a little bit of learning, but for the most part, these are sort of evolutionarily tuned behaviors. So it might not be a good model, for that. But I did want to just, this is a simple answer to your question about how you can think about how information is uncovered in the environment. And so we set up sort of these simple systems that we could say something about analytically. And so this is our spiral algorithm compared to, this is one of the Swarmathon teams, a spoke algorithm where the agents go out, there's no communication, there's just this site fidelity piece, and then a version of this that's randomized. And we thought that there wouldn't be interesting things. These are super simple, right? But what turns out to be really important is that this spiral algorithm, without the agents needing to know any information, it's actually clearing out an area where you know there's nothing left, right? So you're actually getting a ton of sort of implicit information that the next time I go search, I need to go back out to the edge. And I don't need to repeat searching in any territory here. If you have this randomized approach, you can repeatedly search the same location. And if these are not ephemeral resources, that's useless. And there's an interesting geometric problem here, which is that you have to research near the center over and over again, even though you know there's nothing there. So even these really simple things that emerge from simple patterns of movement actually can reveal sort of information about the environment without the agents themselves actually needing to know it. That probably doesn't get to quite your level of the question. But.
Yeah, on the time scale of your robot experiments, what's the rate at which they break down?
Oh God, all the time.
We're going to send them to Mars, and then you have like 20 robots, and a day later they're all dead.
I am not suggesting that we should send our robots to Mars. I would like to send some of our algorithms to Mars, but our robots are probably not the best. Yeah, in fact, when we run the competition, we have a pit crew. So it's like NASCAR, right? And there's just a constant like shifting of the.
No, but that seems like that's an interesting feature, just like including that as part of the modeling itself.
Yeah.
Breakdown.
The breakdown and also the battery life. So we're working now in aerial swarms to do.
Battery life means you have to like have them come back home and recharge.
They have to come back and recharge, and if you're doing things with, so that actually it causes things that don't appear to be foraging problems to become essentially central place foraging because you have to go back home or at least to some location where there's a battery to swap, which makes it a fun problem.
So,
Are we out of time?
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
I wonder how does this type of search algorithm compare to, for example, just sending a robot all out at once, scanning the entire space, and then having to go fetch it once?
Yeah, I mean, basically this is an optimal way to send them out and scan a whole space, right? I mean, you could alternatively do a lawnmower algorithm. And really what we're trying to understand here is if it's not feasible to search the whole space, or maybe are there conditions in which you are better off not searching the whole space, but adapting your search to be more likely to find things. So actually, the ant foraging problem is sort of a time-limited problem in the ants that we study. There's a several-hour window when the temperature and humidity is right and foraging is possible. And they're not trying to exhaust the seeds, right? And so in that particular case, sort of the lawnmower approach is probably not the most effective one. In fact, we've done some simulations that kind of suggest that. Other problems, when the nature of the problem changes, there certainly are problems where just the lawnmower or this, deterministic spiral is the best way to find everything. Our ant-spired approach is actually terrible at finding everything. It's good at finding a large number of things in a short window.